Tonight, we travel back more than 500 years to a royal palace on the River Thames, the Tower of London, and to two young princes at an upper window who will vanish from the record within a single summer. It is the summer of 1483. The boys are brothers. The older one is a king, 12 years old and waiting to be crowned. The younger one is 9, sent to keep him company. For a few weeks, people see them at the windows of the Tower of London, shooting at targets in the garden, playing in the walled yard below. And then, across that one summer, they are seen less and less, and then not at all. There is no funeral. There is no grave that anyone can point to. There is no official word of where they went. 500 years later, we still don't know. So here are a few questions to carry with you tonight. Who were the two boys at that window? And how does a king that young simply stop appearing? If the tower was a prison, why did the older boy arrive there in blue velvet to get ready for his own coronation? Who was the last person known to hold the key to their door? And with no body, no grave, and no confession ever revealed, what do we really think happened to the two princes during that mysterious summer 5 centuries ago? We'll get to all of it soon. But before we set out, if these slow journeys through history help carry you off to sleep, take a moment now to subscribe to the channel, and we will be here to do this for you again, every single night. And if you'd like, tell me in the comments where you're listening from tonight and what time it is as you settle in. Now, dim the lights, pull the blanket up, tuck your feet in. We are going back to London in the spring of 1483 to a great white castle by the water, before anyone thought of it as a place where children vanish. The Tower of London, in 1483, was a palace, one of the grandest royal homes in England, and for a king, a completely ordinary place to stay. At the centre stood the White Tower, a square Norman keep, about 90 feet tall and actually white. It had been whitewashed on purpose so that it could be seen from far down the river and understood at a glance. This is the king's, and the king is not short of money. The windows were small and deep set in walls that were, in places, 15 feet thick. Keep that detail somewhere. Small windows. We'll come back to them. Around the keep spread the inner ward, a working town behind stone. There were kitchens with fires going most of the day, roasting and boiling for hundreds of people. There was a great hall for dining. There were storerooms of ale and wine, ovens turning out fresh bread, cellars, a pantry, a place just for candles, and a laundry. There were guards at the gates and along the walls. There was a curfew bell in the bell tower that rang the day closed. And in the evenings, if the wind was right, you could hear the river. Boats and bargemen working the Thames right up against the outer wall. There were also lions. I want to be clear that I am not being poetic. There was a royal menagerie at the tower, kept near the western entrance, with lions and leopards and, over the years, a rotating cast of animals sent as gifts by other kings. So the soundtrack of this place, the one the two boys would have fallen asleep to, was bells and kitchen clatter and river traffic, and somewhere off toward the gate, a large cat that could in theory have eaten the ambassador. Nothing says serious royal residence quite like that. Kings and queens had a tradition here. The night before a coronation, the monarch would come to the Tower, stay in the royal apartments, spend the evening at prayer, and then, the next morning, ride out west through the city, through cheering crowds, all the way to Westminster Abbey to be crowned. So the Tower was not where a reign ended. It was where a reign was supposed to begin. Which raises the obvious question, the one we'll spend the rest of the night circling. If this was a palace, bright, busy, full of cooks and bells and lions, the place you went to become king, then how did it end up in our memory as the darkest address in England? How did the coronation lodging become the vanishing room? For that, we have to meet the family. And the family had, in the spring of 1483, just lost its head. On the 9th of April, 1483, King Edward IV died. He was only about 40. He had been a big, capable, popular king, the kind who had fought his way to the throne and then mostly managed to keep the country quiet, which in that century counted as a real achievement. He fell ill after what seems to have been a short sickness, and within days he was gone. And a sudden royal death, then as now, is less an ending than a starting gun. Because the moment a king dies, everyone in the kingdom does the same small piece of arithmetic. Who is next? And who actually holds the power until the next one is old enough to use it? The answer to the first question was a boy. Edward's eldest son, also called Edward, was 12 years old. He now became King Edward V. But, and this is the whole engine of the story, he was not in London. He was 130 miles away, at Ludlow Castle, near the Welsh border, where he had been raised and schooled in his own household, surrounded by his mother's family, the Woodvilles. A 12-year-old king, far from the capital, on the wrong side of the country. The answer to the second question was, at first, on paper, simple. The dead king had a younger brother, Richard, Duke of Gloucester. Richard was a grown man, an experienced soldier, and he had spent years governing the north of England on his brother's behalf, and governing it well. Edward IV, in his final days, had named this brother Lord Protector, the man to run the kingdom until the boy king came of age. So on the surface, the machine was built to work. A boy inherits. His capable uncle protects him. In a few years, the boy takes the reins himself. It had a certain tidy logic to it. The trouble is that a Lord Protector was not quite as fixed a thing as it sounds. A dead king's wishes were respected, but they were not iron law. The council could interpret them. And around the boy king stood his mother's family, the Woodvilles, who had spent 20 years gathering titles and marriages and influence, and who were not especially loved by the old nobility. If the boy reached London first, and was crowned quickly and ruled through his mother's relatives, then the uncle in the north, protector or not, might find himself protecting very little. Everyone understood this, which meant that the real contest of 1483 was not going to be fought on a battlefield. It was going to be a race to reach a 12-year-old boy on a road and to decide who would be standing beside him when he entered his capital. Two parties set out toward London that spring. One was the young king's household, bringing him down from Ludlow. The other was his uncle Richard, riding south from Yorkshire. And they were aimed, without quite saying so, at the same point on the map. The two parties met near the town of Stony Stratford at the end of April. The young king's escort had stopped for the night. His uncle Richard arrived, along with another powerful duke, the Duke of Buckingham. Remember that name, Buckingham. He becomes important later. The evening, by every account, was friendly. There was dinner. There was courtesy. Uncle and nephew's men shared a meal like the allies they were supposed to be. And then, in the morning, the mood changed. Richard arrested the men closest to the young king, his uncle on his mother's side, Anthony Woodville, and his older half-brother, Richard Grey, and one or two others. They were taken into custody and sent north, and later they were executed. Whatever the 12-year-old king said or felt as the men who had raised him were led away, the record doesn't preserve. What it preserves is the result. When the household rode on toward London, the boy king was still at its centre, but the people around him now answered to his uncle. Word of this reached London ahead of them, and it landed hard. The boy's mother, Queen Elizabeth Woodville, understood at once what the arrests meant. In the middle of the night, she gathered her other children, including her younger son, 9-year-old Richard of Shrewsbury, and fled into sanctuary at Westminster Abbey. Sanctuary was an old rite. Inside the Abbey's protection, the law could not touch you. It was the medieval version of a locked room the authorities were not allowed to open. A queen, with her children, sitting inside a church, waiting to see what her brother-in-law would do next. That tells you how the wind had shifted. On the 4th of May, the young king finally entered London. And here the story does something almost cruel, because from the outside, this looked like a triumph. The city turned out to greet him. Officials in their robes, crowds in the streets, the whole civic welcome a capital gives a new king. And at the middle of it rode the boy, 12 years old, dressed in blue velvet, the bright, expensive colour of a coronation about to happen. Beside him rode his uncle Richard, and Richard, by contrast, was dressed in black, like a man in mourning for the dead king, his brother. Blue velvet and mourner's black, side by side, through the cheering streets. You can read that picture two ways, and people have been reading it two ways ever since. One way, a loyal uncle, still grieving his brother, escorting his nephew safely home to be crowned. The other way, a boy who did not yet fully understand that he was already, in every way that mattered, a prisoner in his own parade. For now, the boy king was lodged in the bishop's palace near St. Paul's. A coronation was announced. Preparations began, and everything still looked, more or less, like the ordinary business of putting a crown on a young head. The date the coronation stopped looking ordinary is coming, but it comes quietly, and it comes wearing the clothes of something completely normal. On the 19th of May, the young king was moved to the Tower of London. And I need you to feel how unremarkable that was, because our whole memory of this story leans on this one moment and gets it backwards. Moving the king to the Tower was not a sinister act. It was the correct one. As we said at the start of the night, the Tower was where a monarch stayed before a coronation. prayer the night before, then the ride to Westminster. Sending the boy king there was, on that day, exactly what a careful uncle preparing a coronation would do. That is what makes this story so hard to hold. For a long while, nothing that happens looks wrong. It only looks wrong later, once you know how it ends. There was still the matter of the younger brother, though. 9-year-old Richard of Shrewsbury, still in sanctuary at Westminster with his mother. And on the 16th of June, he came out. The details of the persuading are murky. The outcome is not. A delegation went to the Queen, and the younger boy was handed over and taken to the Tower to join his brother. And this is the one genuinely warm beat in the whole cold story, so let's sit in it for a second. For the first time in weeks, the two brothers were in the same place. The king and his little brother, together again, in the royal apartments of a palace they had every reason to think of as a way station, a few nights' stop on the road to a crown. Whatever else was closing in around them, that part was real. They had each other. Then the ground moved. On the 22nd of June, a priest named Ralph Shah preached a sermon at St. Paul's Cross, in the open air, to the people of London. And the sermon made an extraordinary claim that the two boys were illegitimate. The argument was that their father, Edward IV, had secretly been promised in marriage to another woman before he married their mother, a so-called pre-contract, which, if true, would make his marriage invalid and his children unable to inherit. Whether it was true, no one could then prove, and no one has proven since. But it did not need to be true to be useful. It needed to be said out loud in public by a man in a pulpit. Because once the boys were declared unable to inherit, there was a vacancy. And standing right beside it, Lord Protector, grown man, experienced ruler, was their uncle Richard. On the 26th of June, Richard accepted the crown. On the 6th of July, he was crowned King Richard III in a full ceremony at Westminster Abbey. And the other coronation, the one the whole city had spent weeks preparing, the boy king's coronation, was simply never mentioned again. It is a strange thing to misplace a coronation. They are enormous events. Somebody had ordered the cloth. There were arrangements, a date, a plan for a 12-year-old to ride through London in blue velvet and come out the other side a crowned king. And then, without a single announcement that it was cancelled, it just wasn't. The velvet went unworn. The plan dissolved. And the boy it was all built around was, at that point, still very much alive, and still in the Tower a mile or so away where his uncle had left him. The Tower had been normal, the right and ordinary place for a king in waiting. So the question that closes this part of the night is a simple one, and it's the hinge the whole mystery turns on. When did it stop being normal? When did the coronation lodging become something else? Before we lose them, and I'm sorry to say that we do lose them, I want you to spend an ordinary day with the two boys. Not because we have a diary. We don't. But we know, in real detail, how a royal boy of that time lived his hours, and the ordinariness of it is the tenderest thing I can give you tonight. The day began early. The boys would be woken, washed, and dressed, and a royal wardrobe was no small thing. There were fabrics recorded for the young king. Velvet in purple and black and green, satin, cloth of gold, damask, little bonnets lined with satin. Somebody dressed them, somebody else, an esquire of the body, whose actual job it was, stood watch and helped. Then matins, the first prayers of the morning in the chapel, then breakfast. After breakfast, mass, then the schoolroom, because a king still had lessons, and a 12-year-old king perhaps most of all. Latin, letters, the things a ruler was supposed to know. Then dinner, the big meal of the day, taken not in silence, but with a book. It was the custom for noble stories to be read aloud while the boys ate. Tales of knights and kings and old battles, history and legend delivered with the meat and bread. Then some recreation, some exercise, some fresh air in the yard. Archery, maybe, at the targets in the garden. The very targets where, early on, people had seen them play. Then supper, then evensong, the evening prayers, and then bed at around 8 o'clock. Fill that day with the small things that don't make it into the chronicles but were certainly there. A dog underfoot, the smell of the kitchens carrying across the ward, rushes on the floor, wax candles, damp stone, the river air. Chamber walls that in a royal palace could be whitewashed and then painted over with flowers and imitation stonework and hung with rich cloth, so the room glowed in a single warm light after dark. 2 brothers, 9 and 12, in a painted room, being read a story, falling asleep to bells. Hold that picture, because now, over the course of that summer, it begins to narrow. The change is not a scene. There is no door slamming. It is subtler and, in its way, worse. The boys are moved deeper into the inner apartments of the tower. They appear less. The archery in the garden is mentioned, and then it isn't. One of our closest witnesses to these weeks is an Italian visitor named Dominic Mancini, who was in London at the time and wrote down what people in the city were saying. And Mancini records that the boys were withdrawn to the inner rooms and seen more rarely, and then seen not at all. He records one more thing, and it is the detail that stays with you. The young king's physician, a man named John Argentine, was one of the last people known to have attended him. And Argentine, according to Mancini, reported that the boy, 12 years old, had taken to confession and penance because he believed that death was coming for him. I'm going to leave that there, the way the record leaves it, without a scene attached. Not because the moment isn't heavy, because it is, and because a boy at his prayers, being seen a little less each day, is the whole of what we actually know. The rest, what we imagine filling the gap, is us, not the record. So the question, at the end of this part, is not yet were they killed. We're not there. The honest question is smaller and stranger. Why are we seeing them less and less? Who decided that the 2 boys at the window should no longer be at the window? And why did no one, at the time, write down the answer? By the autumn of 1483, the city was talking. Not reporting, talking. There is a difference, and the whole mystery lives inside it. What survives from these months is not a record of an event. It is a record of a fear, The near-contemporary sources, Mancini, and the monk-written chronicle we call the Crowland Chronicle, and worried notes from foreign courts watching England, begin to carry the same low note, that the boys had come to harm, that the sons of Edward IV had, in the careful phrase of the time, met a violent death. But watch what these sources actually do, because it matters. Mancini says the men of London wept when the young king's name came up, fearing he had been done away with. And then Mancini himself admits he could not learn whether it was true, or how, or by whose hand. The Crowland Chronicle notes the rumour and does not claim to know the ending. Across the board, the people closest in time to this all tell you the same honest thing. A rumour spread, and no one could confirm it. And then comes the part that is genuinely eerie, the part that keeps this alive 5 centuries later. There is no body. There is no confession from anyone who did it. There is no inquiry. No one in power stands up and says, "The young king is dead. Here is what happened. Here is who answers for it." There is no funeral, no tomb, no announcement. For 2 boys who were, a few months earlier, the most closely watched children in the kingdom, the record does not so much end as fall silent. One season, they are the center of everything. The next, they are a thing people are afraid to ask about. That silence is the actual monster of this story. Not a dark tower, not a murder scene, a gap. 2 children who were somewhere and then were not, and a kingdom that, for reasons we'll spend the rest of the night trying to understand, chose or was made not to write down where they went. So the fear has a shape now, and we can say it plainly and then set it down for the night. People came to believe the boys were dead. What we cannot do, what nobody, then or since, has been able to do, is prove how, or when, or by whose order. And that is where the story stops being a tragedy with an ending and becomes something else. A case. A 500-year-old case with suspects. Let's meet them. We'll take the suspects in order of how heavily the evidence leans, and it leans, first and hardest, on the uncle. Richard III is the leading suspect. Not the proven killer. I'm going to keep saying that, because the whole discipline of this story is refusing to say more than we know. But the leading suspect, the one against whom the circumstantial case is strongest. And it's worth laying out plainly why. Start with the simplest facts. The boys were in his custody. They were in a royal fortress that answered to him at the time they vanished. He had the means and the opportunity, either by his own hand or, far more likely for a king, by a quiet order given to someone else. And he had a motive, which is the coldest part. As long as the sons of Edward IV were alive, they were a rallying point. It didn't matter that they'd been declared illegitimate. A living son of a popular dead king is always a flag someone can raise. Dead, they could raise nothing. Then there's the silence, which is really the strongest thing against him. Rumours that the boys had been killed were, by the autumn, doing Richard real political damage. And there was one move that would have ended those rumours in an afternoon. Show the boys. Bring them out, alive, into public, and the whispers collapse. Richard never did. If he could have produced 2 living, healthy boys and chose not to, that is very hard to explain in a way that is kind to him. The later accounts pile on top of this foundation. Decades afterward, Thomas More wrote a detailed account naming a man called James Tyrrell as the one who arranged the killing on Richard's orders. More's account is vivid, and it shaped how everyone since has pictured this. But More was writing decades later, under a Tudor regime that had every reason to blacken Richard's name, and no independent confession from Tyrrell survives. So it's a powerful story, not courtroom proof. And more recently, a historian named Tim Thornton noticed something that gives More's version an unexpected bit of support. The sons of one of the men More names as a killer were at the royal court, in Thomas More's own orbit, exactly where More could have heard the story from people connected to it. There's also a will from 1516 in that same family circle, mentioning a chain that had once belonged to Edward V. None of that is a smoking gun, but it makes the old account harder to wave away as pure invention. Now, in fairness, because this whole night runs on fairness, here is the strongest thing pointing the other way. After the boys were declared illegitimate, they were, legally, no longer a threat in the way they had been, and Richard let other barred heirs live. Most notably, a boy named Edward, Earl of Warwick, another possible claimant, was kept alive and in custody, not killed. If Richard was a man who simply removed every rival child, why keep that one breathing? It's a real question, and it's the reason careful people stop at leading suspect and refuse to walk the last step to proven. So we have a strong case and an honest hole in it, which is exactly the condition under which a good detective story does the responsible thing and looks at everyone else in the building. Because Richard was not the only person with access, and he was not the only person with a reason. Come back to that name from the road. The Duke of Buckingham. He was Richard's closest ally in the spring of 1483, right there at Stony Stratford when the king's men were arrested. He was one of the most powerful men in England, with royal blood of his own, and, some believed, ambitions to match it. In some accounts, he held a position that gave him access to the tower itself. So he had proximity, he had standing, and he may well have had a motive of his own. And unlike a lot of theories, this one has some near-contemporary weight behind it. A French writer named Philippe de Comines, writing in this same period, flatly named Buckingham as the man who put the boys to death. A Portuguese document from the time tells a version in which the boys were handed to Buckingham and died in his custody, and an English manuscript held at the College of Arms records that the deed was done, in its own old phrasing, by the vice of the Duke of Buckingham, which seems to mean by his devising or his advice. Historians argue about exactly what that line means and how much to trust it. But it exists, and it points a finger, and it points it at Buckingham. Here's the wrinkle that keeps Buckingham from being a tidy answer. In the autumn of 1483, he turned on Richard. He rose in open rebellion, and he was caught and executed that November. And if Buckingham had murdered the princes, Richard now had the perfect opportunity to say so. His own traitor did it. Don't blame me. Richard never made that accusation, which either means Buckingham didn't do it, or means Richard couldn't blame him without pointing too close to himself. Both readings are possible, and that's the frustrating beauty of it. Then there is a third name, and it's the one that surprises people. Henry Tudor, the man who would become King Henry VII, the man who beat Richard at Bosworth 2 years later and started the whole Tudor line. The motive theory for Henry is real. To secure his throne, Henry married Elizabeth of York, the boy's own sister, and to make that marriage strong, he had to repeal the law that had declared her illegitimate. But repealing that law undeclared her brothers too. On paper, it turned the 2 missing boys back into legitimate sons of a king, which is to say, into better claimants to the throne than Henry himself. So Henry had a powerful reason to prefer them gone. But he has an enormous problem, and it's a problem of the calendar. When the boys vanished in 1483, Henry Tudor was not in England. He was in exile across the sea. Whatever happened in the tower that summer, he was not standing anywhere near it. For Henry to be the killer, you have to believe the boys were kept alive and hidden for 2 more years, through all those months when producing them would have destroyed Richard, and that nobody, in all that time, let it slip. It's not impossible, but it asks a great deal. So the case doesn't narrow as we go. It widens. That's the strange pleasure of this particular mystery. The more carefully you look, the more the single dark figure at the center dissolves into 3 or 4 figures, each with a piece of the motive and none with the whole of the proof. And just when the whole thing feels most like a murder with too many suspects, the story turns over completely and asks whether there was a murder at all. Because there is a whole other possibility we've been holding off, and it's the one that lets you breathe out a little. What if the record went quiet not because the boys were killed, but because someone got them out? It sounds like a fairy tale. It is also, it turns out, an idea people were willing to fight actual wars over. Within a few years of the disappearance, claimants started to appear. Young men who said, in effect, one of the princes did not die. One of the princes is me. In 1487, a boy was crowned in Dublin as King Edward. The Tudor government's account is that he was an impostor, a commoner named Lambert Simnel, put forward as a puppet by Richard's enemies. And the detail that makes this one strangely gentle is what happened to him after. When the rebellion failed, Henry VII didn't execute the boy. He pardoned him and put him to work in the royal kitchens. There are worse endings than turning the spit in a warm kitchen for the rest of your life. The second claimant was more serious. In the 1490s, a young man appeared on the continent claiming to be the younger prince himself, Richard of Shrewsbury, grown up. History calls him Perkin Warbeck and treats him as a pretender. But he was taken seriously by people who were in a position to know. Margaret of Burgundy, the boy's own aunt, recognized him. James IV, the King of Scotland, recognized him and gave him a noble wife. Now, some of that recognition was surely politics. A living Yorkist prince was a very convenient weapon to aim at Henry Tudor, whether or not you believed in him. Warbeck was eventually captured, confessed under pressure that he was an impostor, and was executed. But confessions extracted under a king's pressure are not the firmest ground to stand on either. And then there are the documents, which are the genuinely intriguing part, and which is why this strand refuses to die. There's an accounting receipt from 1487 in the records of Maximilian referring to weapons for a son of King Edward, and researchers on the survival side argue that points to the elder prince alive. There's a document from Gelderland in the Low Countries, an authentic late 15th century document, or copy of one, that claims to tell the younger prince's escape story. Spirited out of the tower in plain clothes, moved through France and Portugal and Ireland and Burgundy. And there's a village in Devon called Coldridge, where a real stained glass window shows an image tied to Edward V, and a memorial to a man named John Evans, and a cluster of odd little clues that some argue add up to a prince living out a hidden, ordinary life far from London. I have to be careful here, and I want you to hear the care, because it cuts both ways. A document being real is not the same as its story being true. The Gelderland paper can be genuinely old and still be propaganda. Exactly the kind of thing you'd forge, well, into existence to support a pretender. The receipt can mean less than it seems. John Evans has never been shown to be Edward V. The honest phrase for all of it is intriguing but unconfirmed. Authentic documents, disputed identities. Not proof of life, but not nothing either. Enough that serious people are still right now working on it. And that's the gift this strand gives the story. It holds a door open. Somewhere in the possible, the two boys at the window walk out of the tower alive, in borrowed clothes, and grow old under other names by a river somewhere far from the one that runs past the tower. We can't prove they did, but no one can quite prove they didn't. And on a night made for sleeping, that's a version worth keeping in the room. There is one more thing to talk about before we let the night go dark, and it's the piece of the story that feels, at first, like it should end the argument. It doesn't, but it's the closest thing to a physical object we have. In the summer of 1674, almost 200 years after that lost summer, workmen were doing demolition at the Tower of London, pulling apart an old staircase near the chapel in the White Tower. And under the stairs, buried in the ground, they found a wooden box. Inside the box were two small skeletons, two children. Remember the White Tower from the start of the night? The tall white keep, the small deep windows, the same building we began in. 200 years on, in the same building, under a stair, two children in a box. The bones were assumed, almost at once, to be the prince's. Charles II, the king of the day, had them gathered up and placed in a marble urn designed by Christopher Wren and interred in Westminster Abbey, where they still are. The urn carries an inscription that names Richard as the murderer, but that inscription was written in the 1670s by people already certain of a story they had inherited. It records a belief, not a finding. It is a 17th century opinion, carved in stone above bones no one had tested. They were examined once in 1933 when the urn was opened, and the examination is a good lesson in the limits of the tools of its day. The examiners concluded the remains were two children of roughly the right ages, about 10 and 12. And that is genuinely suggestive. It fits. But by modern standards, the exam could not do the things we'd now want it to do. It could not firmly establish the sex of the children. It could not date the bones. It could not prove the two were even related to each other, let alone that they were these specific two boys. It matched an age and told a comforting story and stopped where its instruments stopped. Which brings us to the question everyone asks now. Why not test the DNA? We can do remarkable things with old bones today. And the honest answer is a tangle of permission and caution. The remains are in a royal tomb, in a working abbey, and opening a royal grave is not a small ask, and it has, so far, not been granted. But here is the part that surprises people, and it's the humbling heart of this whole final section. Even if it were granted, even if we opened the urn tomorrow and got a perfect result, DNA could, at very best, tell us whether these particular bones belonged to these particular boys. It could confirm the children's identity. It could not tell us how they died. It could not tell us when. And it absolutely could not tell us who gave the order. The one question the whole world wants answered is the one question the bones, by their nature, cannot answer. So the urn sits in Westminster, sealed, holding two children who may be the princes or may be two other lost children of some other century, under an inscription that names a man the bones themselves have never confirmed. It looks like the answer. It's really just the mystery in a nicer container. So where does that leave us at the end of the night? It leaves us with a story that is neither of the two things people usually want it to be. It is not a solved murder, and it is not a debunked legend. It is something rarer and, I think, more interesting than either. A real record of real people, with one bright gap cut out of the middle of it, exactly where the answer should be. Everything around the gap still stands. The White Tower still stands by the river, whitewashed no longer but there. The same small windows, the same stone. The urn still stands in Westminster, sealed. The documents still exist, in their archives, disagreeing with each other as firmly as they have for 500 years. Mancini's account, the Crowland Chronicle, More's story, Comines' finger pointed at Buckingham, the Gelderland escape, the receipt, the window at Coleridge, all real, all still here, all still refusing to line up into a single sentence. We can say what we honestly know. Two brothers, 12 and 9, went into a palace in the summer of 1483 to wait for a crown. They were seen at the windows and playing in the garden, and then they were seen less, and then not at all. There is a leading suspect, their uncle, and a strong case against him that stops short of proof. There are other suspects with real strands of evidence trailing back to them. There is a genuine, unconfirmed possibility that one or both of them lived. And there is a sealed urn that looks like it should settle everything and settles nothing. That's not a failure of the story. That is the story. Most of history closes over cleanly, and we forget it. This one didn't close. It left a gap the exact size and shape of two children, and 500 years of people have stood at the edge of it and looked in, and it has not filled. There's something almost remarkable in that two boys, seen at a window one summer, are still, tonight, keeping the whole world guessing. We're not going to solve it here. No one has. And that's all right. Some doors in history are meant to be left the way we found them. So let the two boys go on standing at their window, where the record last saw them, playing at the targets in the garden with the whole strange rest of it still ahead. That's the last true thing we have of them, and it's a good one to leave the light on. And now, let's let you go too. The night has caught up with us. Let your eyes close if they haven't already. Let the blanket be heavy. Let your feet stay warm and tucked. There's nothing left to figure out tonight. The palace will still be standing in the morning, and so will the question, and neither one needs you awake to keep it. Sleep well, and we'll be here again tomorrow night, with another long walk back into the past, waiting to carry you off to sleep. Good night. In 2017, scientists announced that the Great Pyramid of Giza, a building people have been measuring, mapping, and crawling through for more than 1,000 years, was still hiding a space inside it. A void, at least 30 meters long, sitting high above the pyramid's grandest corridor. No one has been inside it. No one has drilled so much as a peephole into it. The team found it without moving a single stone, and to this day, nobody knows what it is for. That is the strange condition of the most famous building on Earth. We know its height down to the centimeter. Its floor plan is in 1,000 textbooks, and it still has rooms that no one alive has ever been inside. So here is what we'll get to tonight. How do you find a hidden room inside millions of tons of solid stone without drilling a single hole? What did the first treasure hunters find when they tunneled their way into the pyramid 1,000 years ago? And why did the answer bother everyone who came after? Why does the Great Pyramid have shafts too small to crawl through, ending in little stone doors with copper handles? And who seals a door at the top of a shaft no human could ever climb? And what was waiting inside the sealed stone pit that archaeologists opened right beside the pyramid in 1954? A pit that had sat shut, airtight, since the pyramid was new? We'll get to all of it soon. And come out to the edge of the desert, where the biggest sealed box ever built has been standing under the same stars for 4,500 years. Giza is a shelf of limestone on the west bank of the Nile, right where the green farmland gives up and the Sahara begins. 3 pyramids stand on it, and it's worth getting the 2 big ones straight before we go inside. The biggest is the Great Pyramid, built around 4,500 years ago as the tomb of a pharaoh named Khufu. When it was finished, it was the tallest thing human beings had ever built, and it held that record for nearly 4,000 years. The second belongs to his son, the pharaoh Khafra. Khafra's pyramid is slightly smaller, but it plays a trick on every visitor. It stands on higher bedrock, so from most angles it looks like the tall one. And it kept something its famous neighbor lost. A cap of the original smooth casing near its peak, like a mountain that kept its snow. Every pyramid at Giza once shone like that, cased from top to bottom in polished pale stone. Khafra's cap is the last surviving piece of the view. Hold that picture. Khufu's is the biggest. Khafra's is the one with the cap. Tonight's story lives inside Khufu's, the Great Pyramid, because that is the one that keeps turning out to have more inside it than anyone knew. Now, the inside. And this is the part that surprises people. Visitors picture a maze in there. Painted halls, gold, chamber after chamber of treasure. The reality is that the pyramid is almost entirely solid stone. Every known hollow space in it, every passage, chamber, and shaft added together, amounts to a few hallways in a mountain. Here is the whole tour. From the original entrance, up on the north face, a cramped passage runs down through the masonry and into the bedrock itself, ending in a rough, unfinished chamber deep under the pyramid. We'll climb down there properly in a little while. Partway down, a second passage climbs the other way. It leads up to the Grand Gallery, the grandest space in the building. A corridor nearly 9 meters tall, whose stone walls step inward as they rise, course by course, until they almost meet overhead. At the top of the gallery is the King's Chamber. Walls, floor, and ceiling all granite, containing exactly one object: a granite sarcophagus with no lid, no paintings, no inscriptions. A bare stone room holding a bare stone box. Lower down sits a smaller room that explorers long ago misnamed the Queen's Chamber. No queen was ever in it. And above the King's Chamber, sealed away, are 5 low spaces called the Relieving Chambers, which we'll be breaking into shortly with the Victorians. That is the entire known interior. For the most famous building on Earth, it is a floor plan you could sketch on a napkin. Which is exactly why, every time someone finds a new space in it, the whole world stops to listen. Whoever finished the Great Pyramid closed it behind them. The entrance was masked by casing stones. The passage behind it was plugged with granite. The building was designed to be entered once, sealed, and never entered again. The story of the first recorded break-in comes down to us as a tradition, written long after the fact and polished by every century that retold it. So hold it the way you'd hold a good old family story, true in its bones, embroidered at the edges. It goes like this. In the 9th century, more than 3,000 years after Khufu, the Caliph Al-Mamun came to Egypt from Baghdad. He was a ruler famous for founding a great library and funding scholars. Exactly the sort of man who looks at the largest building in the world and needs to know what is installed it. But the original entrance was hidden. From the ground, the north face showed nothing but smooth stone. So his men picked a promising spot and started tunneling. Understand what that meant. 9th century excavation gear was hammers, chisels, fire, and patience. Treasure hunting on this scale required 3 things: manpower, funding, and a willingness to argue with a mountain. His men cut a tunnel sideways into raw masonry, meter after meter, by torchlight, breathing stone dust, with no map and no guarantee there was anything inside but more stone. The story says they broke through into the descending passage and found the way up blocked by those granite plugs, fitted so tightly a knife blade couldn't find the seam. Granite was too hard for their tools, so they did the sensible thing. They cut around it, through the softer limestone, and kept climbing. From there, the way was open, up the ascending passage, into the Grand Gallery, torchlight climbing 9 meters of stepped stone, and at the top, through a low doorway, into the King's Chamber, the room where the treasure of one of the greatest kings of Egypt's greatest age was waiting. You already know what they found, because I told you what that room contains. 1 granite box, the lid gone, nothing inside. No gold, no king, no curse. Not one of the three things a tomb is supposed to owe a treasure hunter. Whether robbers had emptied it centuries earlier, in some break-in nobody wrote down, or whether it was never filled at all, nobody knew. Nobody knows to this day. And that is the moment tonight's story is really about. An empty room in an ordinary building is an anticlimax. An empty room at the heart of a man-made mountain is a question. If the box was bare, where is Khufu? If the chamber was a decoy, what was it protecting? And where? Every robot, every scan, every particle detector in the rest of this story is, one way or another, still trying to answer the question Al-Mamun's men carried back out of that tunnel. The tunnel itself is still there, by the way. Tourists walk through it today. It is the standard way in. The front door the builders sealed so carefully stayed shut. Everyone just uses the burglar's entrance now. Before we climb toward the light and the Victorians, we should go all the way down, because the pyramid's oldest sealed mystery isn't above the Grand Gallery. It's underneath the building entirely. Take the descending passage, the one Al-Mamun's men broke into, and instead of turning upward toward the gallery, keep going down. The passage is barely a meter square, so you move bent double, the slope steady beneath you, the air cooling as you go. Partway down, something changes around you. The pyramid ends and the earth begins. The passage leaves the built masonry and continues, dead straight, into the natural bedrock of the plateau. The builders drove it on beneath their own foundation, down and down, until you stand deeper below the pyramid's base than a 10-story building is tall. And there, carved out of solid living rock, is a chamber, a wide, low room, and the strangest room in the building, because nothing about it is finished. The ceiling is cut flat and true. The floor never got that far. It rises and drops in rough ledges of half-quarried stone, as if the workers set down their tools mid-shift and never came back. In the floor there is a square shaft, sunk a few meters into the rock, stopping blind. Off one wall runs a low, dead-end tunnel that heads south into the bedrock and simply stops. The most precisely engineered building in the ancient world, the same building whose upper chambers are fitted granite you couldn't slide paper into, has at the very bottom an unfinished basement, which should be some comfort to anyone who has ever abandoned a renovation. Why did they stop? Nobody recorded it. The oldest guess is that this was meant to be Khufu's burial chamber, a room beneath the monument in the older style of his ancestors, and that the plan changed mid-build, with the burial moving up into the pyramid's body, where the king's chamber now sits. Others read the roughness as deliberate, a chamber meant to stay raw, standing for the underworld beneath the king's resting place. And some suspect a decoy, a room dug to swallow the ambitions of exactly the kind of visitors who eventually did come down the passage with torches. The record is silent. Take your pick and hold it loosely. What is certain is the place itself, the deepest, oldest room of the Great Pyramid, farther from daylight than any other, cut into rock that was ancient before the first block was ever laid on top of it. The builders finished the attic to perfection and walked away from the cellar. 4,500 years later, we still don't know which of those two rooms mattered more to them. Now climb back up out of the bedrock, all the way to the top of the pyramid's instay, and jump forward 1,000 years to 1837 and to a British Army officer named Colonel Howard Vyse, a man with money, a fascination with the pyramids, and an approach to archaeology best described as direct. Vyse's favorite excavation tool was blasting powder. Nobody would work that way today, and the pyramid still carries his scars. But what he found in the smoke turned out to matter enormously. Here is what drew him. Back in the 1700s, an explorer squeezing through a crack above the king's chamber had found a low, rough space directly over its ceiling. A crawl space with nothing in it. Its floor the flat granite of the chamber roof below. It was written off as a curiosity. Vyse suspected it wasn't alone. If the builders had left one hidden space above the king's chamber, why not more? So he went looking, with candles, ropes, hired crews, and powder. His men blasted a passage upward through the masonry, and chamber by chamber, he was proved right. Above the first crawl space was a second, then a third, a fourth, a fifth. 5 low, sealed chambers stacked over the king's chamber, one on top of another, none of them ever meant to be entered by anyone. Their purpose, engineers later worked out, was structural. They catch the colossal weight of the pyramid pressing down from above and shed it around the king's chamber, so the granite ceiling below doesn't crack. The builders had solved a load-bearing problem, sealed the solution into the building, and told no one. Vyse named the chambers the way 19th century Englishmen named everything, after patrons and heroes. Davison's chamber, Wellington's, Nelson's, Lady Arbuthnot's, Campbell's. 5 sealed rooms above an Egyptian king's burial chamber, wearing names like the guest list of a Regency dinner party. But here is what makes this smoke-blackened episode one of the most important finds in the pyramid's history. On the blocks of those upper chambers, rooms shut since the day they were built, rooms no eye was ever meant to see. There was writing, not carved inscriptions, paint, quick, casual strokes of red ochre, slapped onto the stones by the crews who quarried and hauled them, leveling lines, position marks, and the names of the work gangs themselves. And woven into some of those gang names, the name of the king they worked for, Khufu. Think about what that is. In the entire Great Pyramid, there is no royal inscription, no portrait, no monument to its own maker. The grandest tomb on earth never once mentions its owner. Khufu's name survives inside it in one form only, the handwriting of his construction crews, in rooms they sealed behind themselves on the way out. Not a king's proclamation, a work crew's paint. The builders signed the building. 4,500 years later, by candlelight, behind Vyse's powder smoke, the signatures were still red. The king's chamber and the queen's chamber each have a pair of shafts, narrow, square stone channels about the width of a dinner plate, angling up from the chamber walls into the body of the pyramid. The king's chamber shafts go all the way. Follow them far enough and you come out on the open faces of the pyramid. What they were for is still argued about. Air for the workers, or a symbolic road for the king's spirit to climb to the stars. But at least they go somewhere. The queen's chamber shafts are the strange ones. The builders cut them rising from the chamber like the others, and never finished them. They stop somewhere inside the stone. Stranger still, at the bottom, the final stretch into the room itself was never cut. The shaft sat invisible behind a smooth wall until explorers in the 1800s found them and broke through. Channels that begin behind a wall and end inside a mountain. Nobody could say what they were for. And for a long time, nobody could even look, because no human being fits in a shaft the width of a dinner plate. Which is why, in 1993, a German engineer named Rudolf Gantenbrink built a robot. It was called Upuaut, after an Egyptian god whose name means opener of the ways. Optimistic branding for a machine the size of a shoebox with a camera on its nose. Upuaut crawled up the southern shaft of the Queen's Chamber on little tracked wheels, climbing the smooth stone slope centimetre by centimetre, farther up that shaft than anyone had ever seen. And then it stopped. Not because it broke, because the shaft was blocked by a fitted slab of fine pale limestone, smooth as a door panel, with two small copper pins set into its face, side by side, like a pair of handles. Sit with that image the way the world's Egyptologists did. Far up inside the pyramid, at the top of a shaft no person could ever climb, behind a wall nobody was supposed to find. A door, with handles. A door that could never be opened, closed by people who knew no one would ever try. The obvious question, what's behind it, took 9 years to answer, because the only thing that fits in that shaft is a robot built for the job. In 2002, a new robot went up on live television carrying a drill. It bored a small hole through the blocking stone and threaded a camera through, and the picture came back showing a small, empty space. And at the back of that space, a few hand widths behind the first, another stone. The pyramid had answered a door with a door. 9 more years of engineering, and a third mission went up in 2011. A project named Jedi, after a magician in Egypt's own old stories who was said to work wonders for Khufu himself. Jedi was a different class of machine. It carried a micro-snake camera, a lens on a flexible neck, thin enough to pass through the 2002 drill hole and then bend, looking sideways, up, down, even back the way it came. For the first time, the little space between the two stones could be inspected instead of glimpsed. On its floor, Jedi found marks in red paint, the same casual builder's red from the relieving chambers made by masons before the stone was sealed. For whom and meaning what, nobody can say. And then the camera turned its lens around and did something no one had ever done. It looked at the back of the first door. The 2 copper pins, seen from behind, end in small, neat loops. Careful, finished metalwork on the hidden side of a stone nobody was ever meant to reach. Whatever the little doors were for, someone finished the side of them that faced the dark. The second stone has never been opened, and that is where matters stand today. The running score. Humanity has sent 3 robots to negotiate with 2 stones, and the stones are winning. What is it all for? Nobody knows. And the people who study this for a living say so plainly. The serious guesses, the shafts were symbolic passages for the king's soul, and the little doors are doors in the religious sense, thresholds meant for a spirit rather than a body. Or they are leftover pieces of a design that changed mid-construction. Or they served some purpose in the building process that ended before the pyramid was finished. Every one of these has holes in it. The builders sealed the answer where no one would ever see it, and as far as they knew, no one ever did. They were wrong by 4,500 years and one shoebox-sized robot. So far, every sealed space tonight has been inside the pyramid. This one was outside, a few steps from its southern face, under everyone's feet the whole time. In 1954, an Egyptian archaeologist named Kamal el-Malach was overseeing the clearing of rubble along the Great Pyramid's south side. Beneath the debris, his workers uncovered something with clean, deliberate edges. A long rectangular pit cut down into the bedrock, roofed with a row of massive limestone slabs. The joints between the slabs were sealed with plaster. Sealed in the real sense, closed since the Old Kingdom, and airtight. When the first opening was cut and light fell into that pit for the first time in 46 centuries, there was no chamber underneath it and no treasure. There was a ship. A full-size royal ship, built of cedar, taken apart, piece by piece, and packed into the pit in careful layers. Hull planks here, oars there, coils of ancient rope laid alongside. More than 1,000 pieces. A complete ship, disassembled and packed flat, with no instructions included. The excavators said you could still smell the cedar. It took restorers years to solve the puzzle and rebuild her, and the thing that rose from those stacked planks was a river ship over 40 meters long, with a high, curving prow, a vessel most scholars read as funerary, built to carry the king on the journey of his afterlife. A real ship, seaworthy in its joinery, made with total seriousness for a voyage no living passenger would ever take. In 2021, it was moved across the plateau, whole, to the new Grand Egyptian Museum, where it stands today, often called the oldest intact ship in the world. Remember why this beat belongs in tonight's story. Every other sealed space we touch tonight is still sealed. The void unentered, the little doors shut. The boat pit is the proof that the waiting can end. For 1,000 years, everyone who forced a way into the pyramid found bare stone. Then an archaeologist, working carefully with brushes and levers, clearing rubble a few steps from the south face, opened a pit nobody knew existed, and out came a ship. Giza was not out of surprises. People had simply stopped asking properly. Which brings us to the question this whole night has been leaning toward. How do you find a hidden room in the Great Pyramid now? Because by the 21st century, every old way of searching had been used up or outlawed. Tunneling is vandalism. Blasting is unthinkable. Vice's method now belongs to the same museum as Vice. The pyramid is a protected monument, one of the most protected on Earth. You may not drill it, chip it, or pry at it. How do you search a solid mountain you are not allowed to touch? The answer falls out of the sky. And I mean that literally. So let me spell it out, because it may be the loveliest idea in modern archaeology. Space is full of fast particles. Day and night they slam into the top of Earth's atmosphere, and when they do, they shatter into showers of smaller particles. One of those is called a muon. Muons rain down on the entire planet, everywhere, all the time. They are passing through your roof right now, through your ceiling, through your blanket, through you, by the thousand, every minute, completely harmlessly. They have been falling like this since before there was anyone to notice. Here is the useful part. Muons pass through solid rock too, but not for free. The thicker and denser the stone, the more of them get stopped along the way. A meter of rock absorbs a few. 100 meters absorbs most of them. So, place a muon detector inside the pyramid, in a known chamber low down, and count the muons that arrive, direction by direction. Physicists can calculate precisely how many should survive the trip through 100 meters of solid masonry from any given angle. If solid stone is all there is above you, the counts match the prediction. But if, from one particular direction, too many muons keep arriving, more than that much stone would ever let through, then along that line of sight, some of the stone is not there. Something up there is hollow. That is the entire trick, and it costs the monument nothing, not even a vibration. You set your instruments in the dark and count what falls from the sky. Some of the detectors are nothing more than sheets of special photographic film, in which every passing muon leaves a microscopic track. They sit in place for months, silent slabs doing nothing but being passed through. And when the films are finally developed, each one holds millions of tiny recorded tracks, a long exposure photograph of the sky shining through the pyramid. After Al-Mamun's tunnel and Weiss's powder, this is the politest break-in in the pyramid's long history of break-ins. In the mid-2010s, an international project called Scan Pyramids, Egyptian, French, and Japanese teams working together, set out to do exactly this. Film detectors laid out in the Queen's chamber, other instruments in the passages, and outside on the bedrock. Then months of waiting while the universe did the scanning. 1,000 years of tunnels and gunpowder were about to be outdone by standing very still and counting. The results came in waves, and the first wave started with a landmark climbers and scholars had squinted at for years. Partway up the pyramid's northeastern edge, about 100 meters above the ground, there is a notch, a spot where the clean line of the corner breaks, as if a bite had been taken out of the pyramid. You can see it from the ground if you know where to look. In 2016, the Scan Pyramids teams reported their first conclusive findings, and one of them sat right behind that broken corner. The muon counts showed a cavity, an open space of some kind, tucked just inside the pyramid's edge, 100 meters over the plateau. The other finding was on the north face, behind the chevrons, the great gabled blocks stacked over the original entrance. There, too, the detectors flagged a void. 2 soft spots in a building that was supposed to be solid. Interesting. Modest. A hint of what the method could do. Then, in 2017, the headline, published in Nature, one of the most careful scientific journals in the world. Above the Grand Gallery, the muon counts showed an enormous low-density space, a void with a cross-section similar to the Grand Gallery itself and a length of at least 30 meters. Remember the scale of the thing it sits above. The Grand Gallery is the cathedral moment of the pyramid's interior. 9 meters tall, corbelled walls, the grandest built space of its age. The muons say that above it, buried in what everyone believed was solid masonry, there is another space with a comparable cross-section running on for 30 meters or more, big enough to stand in, big enough to walk down if there were a way in. Nobody has ever found one. The teams did not take their own word for it. Three completely different detector technologies, the photographic films, electronic detector panels in the Queen's chamber, and gas detectors outside the pyramid, were run by separate groups and analyzed independently. All three came back with the same answer in the same place. That is when they published. It was the first major interior structure found in the Great Pyramid since the 1800s, since Vise. Now be careful with the word found, because this is where the honest version is stranger than the tabloid version. The void has never been seen, not by a camera, not by anyone. What exists is a measurement, like a shadow on an X-ray. The muon data gives the void a location and a size, but it cannot say whether the space is level or sloped, one long chamber or several stacked ones, rough or finished. The big void, as everyone now calls it, is a certified absence of stone, 30 meters of guaranteed nothing, which, at Giza, counts as treasure. So what is it? The serious possibilities? It could be a relieving space, a giant cousin of those 5 chambers over the King's chamber, taking weight off the Grand Gallery ceiling. It could be a second gallery. The matching cross-section makes that hard to unthink. And a second gallery would raise the question of where it leads. It could be a construction leftover, an internal ramp or working space the builders used to raise the blocks, then sealed behind them. Or it could be something connected to the burial itself, which is the possibility nobody says too loudly, because that empty granite box has been waiting for an explanation for 1,200 years. The muon data supports none of these over the others. Every one of them is, so far, undefeated. It has also, of course, been drafted into every hidden chamber legend on the internet. Secret halls of records, lost archives, stranger things. The counting supports none of that either. What the science says is exactly this, and no more. Above the grandest corridor of the Great Pyramid, there is far less stone than there should be, and nobody alive knows why. Al-Mamun's men left the pyramid with a question: where is Khufu? 12 centuries later, we still don't have the answer. What we have is the exact address of the pyramid's biggest unanswered space, measured to the meter, entered by no one. The big void may stay sealed for a long time, but the other anomaly from 2016, the one behind the chevrons on the north face, has a different ending. That one we have now seen inside. It took 11 years of patient work. The muon teams narrowed the anomaly down until it had a shape, corridor-like, roughly 9 meters long, about 2 meters wide, sitting just behind the chevron blocks above the original entrance. Then other instruments, ultrasound and the rest of the toolkit of non-destructive testing, pinned its position against the joints of the north face. And then, in 2023, came the finale, an endoscope, a camera on a flexible tube fed carefully through a gap between the ancient stones. Not a hole drilled in the pyramid, a gap the masonry already offered. The pictures came back that spring, and the world got its first look at a space inside the Great Pyramid that no living eyes had ever seen. A bare corridor of rough limestone with a peaked stone ceiling ending in blank walls, unfinished, empty. Its purpose, like everything else tonight, is not settled. The leading idea is that it spreads the weight of the pyramid away from the original entrance below it, or that it relates to some feature not yet found. Hypotheses, both, and stated as such by the people who found it. And I'll say this in its favor. There is something close to perfect about it being empty and plain. This is a space the builders sealed shut, knowing no one would ever stand in it. It isn't decoration, and it isn't treasure. It is careful, invisible engineering, work done to last forever and be seen by nobody. For 4,500 years, that plan held. Then we looked anyway and broke nothing doing it. Count the progression, because it is the spine of this whole story. Al-Mamun needed 100 men and a tunnel. Vise needed blasting powder. The 21st century needed particles falling from space and a camera the width of a pencil, slipped through a gap the masons left. Each century's break-in has been smaller than the last. And the biggest prize is still up there. The corridor was the smaller of the two discoveries, 9 meters, tucked behind the entrance. The big void is 30+ meters of unexplained space, high in the pyramid's body, with no joint in the masonry offering a path to it. The teams keep refining the picture, and the detectors keep counting. If the pattern of the last 12 centuries holds, someone will eventually find a way to look, smaller and cleverer than anything tried before, without moving a single stone. So let's lay the night's inventory out plainly, one last time, and then put it away. Inside Khufu's Great Pyramid, a void at least 30 meters long above the Grand Gallery, found by counting particles from space, entered by no one. A small corridor behind the north face chevrons, seen once through a lens on the end of a tube. 5 low chambers signed in red paint by the crews who built them. 2 small stone doors with copper handles, still shut. An empty granite box that started 1,000 years of questions. And at the bottom of everything, a rough room cut into the bedrock, which the builders never finished and never explained. Beside the pyramid, the pit that held a cedar ship, whole and fragrant, for 46 centuries. Proof that at Giza, the waiting can end, and end wonderfully. Somewhere on the Giza plateau right now, it is deep night. The visitors are gone, the gates are locked, and the muons are falling. Through the dark, through the pyramid, through the void, down into the bedrock. A few of them are ending their long trip inside a detector, becoming one more count in a number that is slowly turning into knowledge. The search never ended. It only grew more patient. The builders finished their work, sealed it, and went home. And their sealed spaces have outlasted every empire that rose and fell around them. Somewhere above the tourists' heads, measured to the meter and touched by nothing, the pyramid's biggest unanswered space is holding its shape in the dark, the way it has every night for 4,500 years. There is no rush. It has kept this long. Let the room stay shut for one more night. Dim the last light. Pull the blanket up. Tuck your feet in where it's warm. Tonight, the story rests on the best possible page. The one where the room has been found and not yet opened. Good night. On the 15th of January 1919, a wall of molasses about 2 stories tall came down a street in Boston, and by the time it stopped moving, 21 people were dead. Not a flood of water, not a fire, molasses. The dark, sweet syrup you might put on bread or stir into a cake. A whole tank of it, more than 2 million gallons, let go all at once on a mild winter afternoon and rolled through a crowded neighborhood faster than the people in it could run. It sounds like the kind of story your buddy would swear was true after downing 1 too many drinks. But every word of it is true, and tonight we are going to walk through all of it, slowly, from the very beginning. Here is what we'll get to. How a tank of syrup ends up killing 21 people and injuring 150 more. Why the company that owned that tank stood up almost immediately, and what they swore was the real cause. And how a city even begins to clean a sea of molasses out of its streets, its cellars, and its harbour. We'll get to all of it soon. We're going back to Boston, to a working waterfront in the winter of 1919, to a corner of the city where a very large brown tank stood beside the harbour. For years that tank had leaked and groaned and dripped molasses onto the street where anyone could see it. Nobody treated it as a warning. We will. To understand this, you have to stand in the north end of Boston as it actually was, just over 100 years ago. It was one of the most crowded neighborhoods in the country. Narrow streets, red brick tenements stacked 4 and 5 floors high, laundry strung between windows, and people, a great many people, most of them recent immigrants. Italian families, mostly, along with Irish labourers who had come a generation before. It was poor, it was loud, it was alive, and it ran on work. The whole edge of it pressed up against the harbour, where the wharves and the freight yards and the warehouses did the actual business of a port city. It was a neighbourhood that had been arriving for decades. Boats came in at the wharves a few streets over, and a good share of the people stepping off them ended up right here, in these blocks, because this was where the cheap rooms and the work were. They built a whole world in a few crowded streets, bakeries, churches, markets, front stoops where the entire building's life happened in summer. They also had very little money and very little say in how the city was run. We'll come back to that second part because it matters a great deal to how this story got told afterward. Running right over the waterfront was the Atlantic Avenue Elevated, the L, a raised railway on iron legs that carried trains above the street and threw the whole block into shadow underneath. Down at street level, it was horse-drawn freight wagons and the first motor trucks, the kind with hard rubber tires and an engine that sounded like an argument. Teamsters, dock workers, city paving crews, lunch carts, children cutting through on their way home from school. And on Commercial Street, right at the water's edge, stood the tank. It was enormous, about 50 feet tall, picture a 5-story building, and about 90 feet across, made of curved steel plates riveted together, painted a dull, dark brown. It belonged to a firm called the Purity Distilling Company, which was tied to a much larger outfit, the United States Industrial Alcohol Company. And it held molasses. Not the molasses for your kitchen. Industrial molasses, blackstrap, shipped up by the boatload from the Caribbean to be turned into alcohol. Some of it for rum. A great deal of it in those years for munitions, because industrial alcohol went into making explosives, and there had just been a very large war. So there's the first small irony of this whole story, and we'll only point at it once. A tank full of the raw material for explosives, which everyone would later insist had been blown up by one. Now, here is the part you need to hold on to. That tank leaked. It had leaked almost from the day it was built. Molasses seeped out from between the seams, ran down the brown steel, and pooled at the base. The neighborhood knew. You could hear the tank groan when it was full. Children from the nearby streets used to go and scoop the leaks straight off the ground and carry the molasses home, which tells you two things at once: that the leaking was constant and obvious, and that this was a neighborhood where free molasses was worth collecting. And the company knew too. They knew so well that they took action. They sent a man out to paint the tank brown. The leaks had been easier to see against the bare steel, so they painted over them. The color you've been picturing this whole time, that dull rust brown, was chosen, in part, so the bleeding tank would stop looking like it was bleeding. The leak was the warning. The fix was a coat of paint. Hold that thought, because in a few hours from where we're standing, it's going to matter enormously. January 15th, 1919 was, of all things, a nice day. That part matters, so let's sit in it. It was January in Boston, which usually means cold that gets into your teeth. But this particular week had been mild, and the day had climbed up to around 40 degrees. The hard freeze of the days before had let go. The streets were bare. There was no real snow on the ground. After a stretch of true winter, it was the kind of afternoon where people lingered outside a little longer than they needed to, because it felt good to. It was just before lunch. Picture the waterfront going about its business. Down on Commercial Street, under the shadow of the L, teamsters were working their horse wagons. A freight train sat up on the elevated tracks. City workers from the paving division were in and around their building. Men were loading and unloading along the wharves. Over at the firehouse, Engine 31, the fireboat crew, a few of the men were sitting down to a midday meal and a game of cards. And there were children, some on their lunch break, some sent on errands, some just cutting through. A 10-year-old named Pasquale Iantosca was out near the tank. A 10-year-old named Maria Di Stasio was down at the base of it, gathering firewood and scraps, the way children in the neighborhood did. A boy named Anthony Di Stasio was walking home from school. Around them, the neighborhood was at its loudest hour. Carts and trucks were lined up along the wharf to take on freight. A street vendor calling his prices, an argument across a courtyard, the iron rumble of a train passing overhead on the L, the ordinary racket of a working waterfront at midday, the kind of noise you stop hearing because it never stops. Steam came off the harbor. Gulls worked the water. The air smelled of salt and coal smoke, and underneath everything, faintly sweet, of molasses. These are the ordinary people of an ordinary hour. None of them were waiting for anything to happen. That's the thing about a day like this. There's no warning in it. The men playing cards thought the worst thing about their afternoon would be losing the hand. The teamsters were thinking about their next load. The children were thinking about whatever 10-year-olds think about, which is to say, not very much, and all of it important. Above them, full nearly to the top, sat the tank. A few days earlier, it had taken on a fresh delivery, a big shipment of warm molasses, brought up from a ship and poured in to join what was already there. Warm molasses into a tank that had been standing in deep winter cold. We'll come back to why that matters, because it matters a great deal. For now, just know the tank was as full as it had been in a long time, and the day around it was unusually warm, and everyone underneath it was thinking about lunch. Somewhere in the steel, between two rows of rivets, a crack that had been there for years finally began to move. It started as a sound. People who were there and lived described it in different ways. A deep rumble, a long metallic groan, a noise some of them said was like a machine gun, which was the rivets letting go one after another as the seams of the tank unzipped. And then the side of the tank simply came apart, and 2 1/3 million gallons of molasses came out all at once. Throw out the picture in your head, because it's wrong. When you think molasses, you think slow. You think of the stuff creeping off a spoon while you wait. But that is molasses in small amounts, at room temperature, behaving politely. 2 million gallons of it, released in a single instant, is not polite and is not slow. By most estimates, the wave that came out was somewhere between 15 and 30 feet high. Accounts vary, and we'll treat the exact number as the guess that it is. And it moved down the street at something like 35 miles an hour. Think about that. A wall of syrup, taller than a house, moving faster than you can run. And it was worse than water would have been, which is the part the scientists find genuinely interesting. Molasses is dense, far heavier than water for the same amount, so the wave hit with tremendous weight behind it. And because the day was mild and the molasses had come in warm, it was still loose and fast when it broke out. As it spread and began to cool in the January air, it did the opposite of what a flood of water does. It got thicker. It got stickier. It began to set. So the wave came in fast enough to knock down buildings, and then turned slow and heavy enough to hold everything it had caught. It was the worst possible version of both. Years later, scientists actually sat down and did the math on this, because it turns out to be a genuinely hard problem in physics. They worked out that the warm molasses, poured in only days before, sat maybe 5 degrees warmer than the freezing air outside the tank, and that warm, loose syrup suddenly let go, behaved almost like water at first, fast and heavy, before the cold could catch up with it. The same cold weather that should have made the afternoon safer is part of what turned the wave into a trap. It let the molasses run like a flood, and then set like mortar around whatever it had reached. This is one of the very few disasters in history where you genuinely need a fluid dynamics laboratory to explain why so many people could not simply climb back out. What it did in those first seconds is hard to take in. It lifted a train off the elevated tracks above and bent the great iron legs of the L like they were soft. It picked up freight cars and wagons and flung them. The firehouse, Engine 31, was shoved off its foundation and partly crushed, with the men still inside. Tenements came off their footings. The paving division building was wrecked. Horses, a great many horses, were caught in the street and could not get free. And it all happened in about the time it has taken me to describe it. There was no warning anyone could have used. One moment, it was a mild afternoon on the waterfront and people were thinking about lunch. And the next, there was a brown tide going through the neighborhood at the speed of a car. And then, almost as fast, it began to thicken and go still, with the whole street caught inside it. We're going to go in among the people now. I'll be brief, and I'll be careful, because they deserve that. But you should know who was in that street. 21 people died in the Molasses. About 150 more were hurt. I'm going to tell you about 2 of them, and then I'm going to tell you about everyone who came running, because that second part is longer and it's the part worth holding. Near Copp's Hill stood the home of the Clougherty family. When the wave hit, it took the house off its foundation and broke it apart. Bridget Clougherty, 65 years old, died in the collapse. Her son Martin lived, and he lived because, in the middle of all that wreckage and rising molasses, he caught hold of a bed frame and held on, and the bed frame floated, and he stayed with it until he could be pulled out. A man saved by a bed in the ruins of his own house. I'll let that stand on its own. And there was the boy I mentioned, Anthony Di Stasio, walking home from school when the wave reached him. It carried him along and rolled him under, and his family, searching afterward, at first believed he was gone. He was not. He was pulled out alive. Not everyone's story turns that way. Most did not. But his did. And on a night like this, I'd rather hand you the one that did. Now, within minutes, the neighborhood and the city came for the people in the street. Some of the first were already there. Sailors. A naval training ship, the USS Nantucket, was berthed nearby, and a crew of cadets ran straight into the molasses to start pulling people out. Boston police came. The Red Cross came, set up stations, and went to work. Doctors and nurses. Firefighters, including the men of Engine 31, who had been hit themselves and dug their own out. And neighbors, ordinary people from the surrounding streets, who waded in up to their waists in setting molasses to reach for whoever they could feel. Within the hour, it had become an organized rescue. The Red Cross set up a relief station, and then something close to a field hospital. Nurses and doctors worked on the injured where they lay and carried the rest off to the city hospitals. Volunteers came in from across Boston as the news spread. And the work did not stop when it got dark. They strung up lights and kept going through the night and into the next day, because the molasses gave its people up only a little at a time, and everyone there understood that somewhere under that brown surface there were still men and women to be reached. It was brutal work, and it was slow, and that was the molasses doing. The stuff coated everything. It pulled the boots off rescuers and held their legs. It hardened as the afternoon cooled, so that a person caught in it was caught more firmly by the hour. You could not simply wade to someone and lift them. You had to dig them free of a substance that was turning around your hands into something closer to cement. They worked into the night under lamps, and then through the days that followed, because some of the lost were not found quickly. One man, Cesare Niccolo, was not recovered for months. He was found later beneath a wharf. I'm going to leave the dead there, with their names said and their dignity intact, and not make you sit in it any longer. Because the thing that happens next, once the people are out, is that an entire city has to figure out how to clean up an ocean of syrup. And strangely enough, that part The cleanup is where the warmth of this story actually lives. When the rescuing was done, Boston was left with a problem that has very few parallels in the history of cities. How do you remove 2 million gallons of molasses from a neighborhood? It was everywhere. It was knee-deep in the streets, and it was in the cellars, and it was up the walls of the houses that still stood. It was in the harbour, and it was setting harder every cold night. You cannot shovel it like snow. It pulls back. You cannot just hose it with fresh water. Fresh water mostly sits on top of it and gives up. What worked in the end was salt water, harbour water. It turned out that salt water broke the molasses down, loosened it, made it something that could be moved. So the city brought in the fireboats and the pumps and sprayed the streets and the rubble with water pumped straight out of Boston Harbour, again and again, washing the molasses loose and sending it back where a lot of it had come from. After the water, sand. They spread sand over the streets to soak up what was left and to give people something to walk on that wasn't glue. Hundreds of people did this work for weeks. And here's the small, stubborn human detail I love about it. They tracked it everywhere. Rescuers and cleanup crews and gawkers walked through the molasses and then got on the streetcars and went home. And so a thin film of molasses spread across half of Boston. Onto trolley seats, station platforms, doorknobs, telephones, anything a sticky hand touched. For a while, the whole city was faintly, absurdly tacky. The disaster was at the waterfront, but the stickiness went home with everyone. The cleanup of the waterfront itself went on for weeks, and then months. Crews worked the streets and the cellars and the wrecked buildings over and over, because molasses doesn't leave a place all at once. You clear a stretch of street, and the next warm hour more of it works back out of the brick and the gaps in the floorboards. Hundreds of people were on it at a time. They hauled away the broken houses and what was left of the firehouse, dug the dead horses out of the hardening syrup, and washed the same blocks again and again until the salt water finally won. The harbour took longest. Boston Harbour was stained brown, visibly, openly brown, well into the summer of 1919, months after the wave, the molasses slowly working out of the wharves and the water. And the smell stayed in the north end for weeks, a heavy sweetness over the wet brick. There's an old story that goes further than that. It says that for decades afterward, on hot summer days, the north end still smelled of molasses, the heat drawing it up out of the old timbers and the ground. That one is folklore. People genuinely remembered it and repeated it for years. And it's an eerie thing to imagine, but no one can actually prove it. File it where it belongs, not as a fact, but as the kind of story a neighborhood tells about a wound long after the wound has closed. The streets were cleared. The harbour came clean by summer. The houses were scrubbed. And that left the one thing molasses doesn't wash off, which is the question of whose fault it was, because the company was still saying a bomb. It's worth stopping on that claim, because it is the part of this whole story that should make you angry. The tank had come apart and killed 21 people in a neighborhood full of witnesses, and the company's answer was that someone had done this to it. Sabotage, dynamite, an enemy in the night. And to be fair, in January of 1999, the claim was not as ridiculous as it now sounds. You have to remember where the world was. The Great War had just ended. The country was raw, suspicious, and full of men who had recently been taught that the correct response to a disagreement was high explosives. And Boston, specifically, had a live and genuine fear of bombings. There were anarchist groups, some of them real, some of them imagined, who did target factories and officials. Devices did go off. The newspapers were full of it. Within a few months of the Molasses disaster, anarchists would in fact set off bombs in several American cities on the same night. So when a company executive stood up and said the tank must have been dynamited, there was, sitting right there, a whole climate ready to believe him. There was also a second thing the climate was ready to do, and it is less comfortable. The North End was an Italian immigrant neighborhood, and Italian immigrants in 1919 were widely treated as suspects first and people second. Anarchist and Italian were words that a lot of respectable Bostonians used almost interchangeably and unfairly. So a story that said a bomb did this was also, conveniently, a story that pointed away from the company and toward the very people who lived in the tank's shadow and had been collecting its leaks off the street. And then there was a third theory floating around, a quieter one, that the molasses itself had fermented into the tank, building up gas pressure until the whole thing burst from within. That one, at least, had the decency to involve the molasses. Now look at this from the company's side of the table, just for a moment. You own a 50-foot tank that everyone in the neighborhood has watched leak for years. It has just come apart and killed 21 of your neighbors. You can stand up and say, "We built it too thin, we never tested it, and we painted over the evidence." Or you can say, "Anarchists." One of those answers costs you everything. The other one costs you a press release. They went with the anarchists. And for years, not weeks, years, they fought to make that story stick, because the alternative was admitting what they had done. But a story about a bomb can only hold up for as long as nobody looks too hard at the tank. So that is what we're going to do now. The one thing the company spent all those years hoping no one would insist on. We're going to take a hard look at the tank itself. So let's take the tank apart, the way the investigators eventually did. The truth here is not a riddle. It's a list. It was always a list. Start with the steel. The tank's walls were too thin for the job. Too thin to hold the weight of more than 2 million gallons of dense molasses pushing outward. That's not hindsight. The numbers were there to be checked. And when people finally checked them, the walls did not have the strength the load required. And the steel itself was the wrong kind. It was brittle, prone to cracking rather than bending. Good steel, under strain, will flex and warn you. This steel was the sort that holds and then splits, with no give in between. The exact chemistry of it has been argued over ever since, so I won't hand you a number nobody can stand behind. But the direction isn't in doubt. The metal was more likely to crack than to stretch, and a tank is exactly the wrong place for metal that cracks. Then the rivets and the seams, the places the molasses had been weeping out of for years. Those weren't a cosmetic problem. A leak is a structure telling you, in the only language it has, that the joints are under more strain than they can take. The neighborhood read that message correctly enough to bring buckets. The company read it and bought paint. And the tank was never properly tested. There's a basic, old, boring way to check a tank like this before you trust it. You fill it with water first. Water is heavy, it's safe, and if the tank can hold a full load of water without weeping or bulging, you've learned something. If it can't, you've learned something far more useful, and nobody dies finding it out. The tank on Commercial Street was, by the accounts of the inquiry, never given that test. It went more or less straight from built to full of molasses, with the checking step skipped, and the whole thing had gone up fast, under wartime pressure to produce, overseen by a manager who didn't have the engineering training the job called for. Now bring back the warm shipment. A few days before it failed, the tank had been topped up with a large load of warm molasses, fresh off a ship poured in among the cold. So the contents were warmer than the deep winter air around the steel, and warm molasses is thinner and more active and pushes around differently than cold. You have a tank already too weak, already cracking, already leaking, already untested, and into it you pour a warm, restless, heavy load in a stretch of unusually mild weather, with the temperature swinging around the freezing line day to night. Somewhere in that, a crack that had been creeping along for years reached its limit, and the seam let go, and then the next, and then all of them. That's the whole murder weapon. Not dynamite. Thin steel, bad steel, old leaks, no test, a rushed build, and a warm load on a mild day. Every single item on that list was known or knowable before anyone died. None of it required an anarchist. It required only that the people who owned the tank keep choosing not to look, and, when they couldn't help looking, choose a bucket of brown paint. The company fought anyway. After the disaster, the survivors and the families of the dead brought their claims, and they were folded together into one enormous case against the United States Industrial Alcohol Company. And the company held its line. It was a bomb, it was sabotage, it was anarchists, anything but the tank. So the whole question went in front of a court, and the court handed it to a single court-appointed auditor, a man named Hugh W. Ogden, to sort out what had actually happened. What Ogden did next is, in its own undramatic way, the hero's part of this story. He sat and he listened. For 341 days of testimony, he listened. To engineers, to witnesses, to metallurgists, to the company's experts insisting on the bomb and the family's experts walking him through the steel. Years of it. And at the end of all that listening, in the spring of 1925, more than 6 years after the wave, he delivered his finding. There was no bomb. There were no anarchists. The tank had failed because it was built and overseen without enough care for whether it would hold. Structural failure and inadequate attention to safety plainly assigned, plainly the companies. He found the United States Industrial Alcohol Company responsible, and the company paid. It is worth saying out loud what that meant, because it was rare. A large, well-defended corporation had picked the most frightening story available. Foreign terrorists, bombs in the night, and pointed it straight at a poor immigrant neighborhood. And a patient man with no stake in the outcome sat through nearly a year of testimony and said, in effect, no. The thing that did this was you, not the people who lived under your tank. You. And it didn't stop with one verdict. The Molasses case became one of the cases that engineering and the law point back to when they talk about why we do things the way we do now. In the years that followed, states moved toward rules that we take for granted today. That the person who designs something like that tank has to be a licensed engineer, that they have to sign and seal the plans and put their name and their responsibility on the work, and that an inspector has to come and check it. The idea that you can't just throw up a 50-foot tank of industrial molasses over a neighborhood and paint over the leaks. That idea has a few parents, and one of them is a street in the North End of Boston. It's worth slowing down on that, because it's the part that reaches all the way into your life and mine. Before disasters like this one, a great many large structures went up more or less on a handshake and a confident manager. After cases like this one, the rules tightened. The math had to be done by someone qualified to do it. The plans had to carry a real name and a real stamp. And someone independent had to come and check the work before it was trusted to stand over people's heads. Every water tower you drive past, every parking garage you walk under, sits inside a system of professional responsibility that grew, in part, out of catastrophes that proved what happens without it. The molasses tank is one of the catastrophes that taught that lesson the hard way. That's the part that's bigger than the wave. The wave lasted a few minutes. The lesson is in the building codes. If you go to that stretch of the North End today, you won't find the tank. It was never rebuilt. The waterfront has changed. There's a park there now, and people walk dogs and play ball where the molasses once stood 5 stories high. There's a small plaque, the kind you could walk past 100 times without reading, that tells you what happened on that spot on a mild January afternoon in 1919. The harbour is clean. The L is long gone. The neighbourhood went on the way neighbourhoods do. Before you drift off, here's the part of this that stays with me. It isn't the size of the wave, though the wave is the part that gets told. It's that none of it was hidden. There was no twist, no secret, nothing that took a genius to see coming. The tank leaked where children could scoop it off the ground. It groaned when it was full. The fix was a coat of paint. Every warning this story had, it gave out loud for years to anyone standing nearby. The horror of it isn't that something unimaginable happened. It's that something completely imaginable happened, slowly, in plain sight, and the people who could have stopped it found it cheaper not to. That's the thing the molasses left behind. Not a smell in the timbers, whatever the old story says, but a hard, useful idea that we still live inside. That if you build the thing, you sign your name to it, and the warning signs are not someone else's problem to scoop off the street. So that's where we'll leave it. The harbour brown till summer, then clear. The names of the lost said and kept. And a row of building codes, somewhere in a drawer in a city office, that exist in part because of one warm afternoon in Boston. The lights are already low. Your blanket's up. Your feet are tucked in. The tank came down more than 100 years ago. The people who came running came just as long ago. It's all finished now. Rest well. We'll be here again tomorrow night with another one.